Hello, my name is Elaine Ashton. I'm a speech and language therapist and researcher from Newcastle University in the UK. This presentation comes from the Lively, the Language Intervention in the Early Years project, and the presentation will describe an intervention study that aimed to measure the effectiveness of delivering language intervention in languages other than English for bilingual children. And as part of the process of carrying out the study, we've reflected on the enablers and barriers for monolingual speech and language therapists when working with bilingual children. So to start with, let us consider the impact of language difficulties for children. 7 to 19% of preschool children have poor language skills, increasing to 50% for preschool children from the most socially disadvantaged groups. Children aged 4 years with poor language skills are likely to have persisting difficulties with associated risks of poorer educational, employment and psychosocial outcomes which continue into adulthood. Therefore, early intervention is key. So in terms of bilingualism, we know that bilingualism is an advantage. It's an advantage socially, communicatively and cognitively. Bilingualism does not contribute to speech, language and communication needs. However, bilingual children are just as likely to have speech, language and communication needs as monolingual children. So therefore, speech and language therapists need to assess all languages the child speaks because it enables an accurate picture of the child's linguistic knowledge across all languages, and also because bilingual language development is different to monolingual language development. Not supporting all the child's languages is seen as a failure to meet their health needs. But working in a child's home language promotes social identity, family life, cultural and religious community. However, not encouraging home language can impact the child's links to their culture, their contact with extended family, and can lead to loss of their home language. Currently in the UK, 29% of nursery-aged children and 21% of primary school children speak a first language other than English. And most UK speech and language therapists are monolingual, therefore they'll need to work with interpreters when working with bilingual children. And working with interpreters has been identified as a core skill for speech and language therapists. However, many speech and language therapists have limited experience of working with interpreters, and they might not feel confident to do so. A challenge for speech and language therapists is to make a decision about differential diagnosis. Does the child have a language disorder in all of the languages they speak or difficulties learning a second language? We know that standardised assessments are not a reliable means of testing for bilingual children as the norms are based on monolingual children. Unfortunately, there may be a preference for delivering intervention in English rather than in the home language. And this might be because the clinician is monolingual and English is the majority language in the UK, as well as the language of education. However, delivering intervention in English only is ineffective and leads to poor outcomes for bilingual children. So a little bit more about the Lively project. The Lively project is made up of 2 parts, a randomised control trial, an RCT, comparing 2 language interventions for monolingual children delivered in education settings. And the interventions are building early sentences therapy, BEST, and an adapted form of the Derbyshire language scheme. The second part of the Lively project is the bilingual project, which focused on a single case methodology where the child's ability to use sentences would be tested in every session to monitor their progress. The aim of the bilingual project was for an experienced speech and language therapist to work with interpreters to deliver BEST in Mir Puri, a Pakistani heritage language, Sylheti, a Bangladeshi heritage language, and Polish. And again, the intervention would be delivered in education settings. The target was to work with 3 or 4 children in total across all 3 languages. But in terms of recruitment and eligibility, we ended up with 1 nursery-aged Sylheti-speaking child who was 3 years 10 months at the time of recruitment, and 1 Polish-speaking child who was in reception class, and 4 years 7 months at the time of recruitment. So building early sentences therapy is a play-based early language intervention for children between the ages of 3 and 6 years with severe language difficulties. The language intervention is input-based so the children can listen and join in at their own pace. It's usually delivered in a group, which means the children can hear sentences on multiple occasions, but it can also be delivered one-to-one. The intervention focuses on sentence frame and predicate argument structure. So for example, agent plus verb plus patient structures in sentences like the man is eating an apple. All content, words and grammar are signed using Paget-Gorman signing system, so then the approach is multimodal. And each session is scripted and each session follows the same structure. BEST has already been delivered successfully in clinical contexts, and it's also been delivered in a range of languages already, including Mirpuri. So for the bilingual project, the first stage of preparation was to recruit schools and identify bilingual children with speech, language and communication needs. 35 schools were involved in the Lively RCT, and 8 of those schools were identified as having high numbers of children with English as an additional language. Those 8 schools were contacted and only 4 schools replied. 1 school had Sylheti speaking children and 1 school had Polish speaking children. We then needed to find local interpreters who could speak the targeted language, and there weren't many interpreters around, but we did eventually find and book 1 Sylheti speaking interpreter and 1 Polish speaking interpreter for the project. We adapted existing resources from the Lively RCT, working with native speakers with linguistic knowledge. And they were also either early years practitioners or speech and language therapy assistants. In the adaptations, it was important to include morpheme by morpheme translations because languages like Polish are more morphologically complex than English, so they mark for accusative and dative case endings, and Sylheti is a subject-object-verb language, whereas English has a subject-verb-object word order. There were some issues with vocabulary and language structures in the translation. So for example, in the original resources, the verb to wave was included, but this was a westernised gesture and there isn't an equivalent in Sylheti, so it wasn't used. Piloting of resources was essential, so we worked with typically developing Polish and Sylheti speaking children with the interpreters to check that the vocabulary and linguistic structures worked in real life contexts, and the interpreters were able to give us some helpful feedback. So changes that we did include related to things like vocabulary items. So the version of the word car we used in Polish, the Polish interpreter suggested was quite old-fashioned, and she gave us a more up-to-date acceptable form. So here is an example from part of the BEST intervention session, and you can see the adaptations of the script into both Sylheti and Polish. And in both the Sylheti and Polish versions we have morpheme by morpheme translations throughout. Preparation for the bilingual project also included preparation for working with interpreters. We looked at the existing guidance about working with interpreters, and there is some, but there isn't a lot. And most of the guidance focuses on the process of interpreting between adults. So whether it's simultaneous or consecutive interpreting, it gives recommendations about how to interpret technical vocabulary as well as non-verbal communication, and suggestions about seating position, etc. However, there is limited information about how to actually make interpreting work in a play-based situation with a child. It's good practice to have a pre and post debrief in all sessions, and this was planned and booked into all of our sessions. And the interpreters were also trained in how to deliver assessments, so they were trained not to give additional cues or change the wording of the assessment instructions. And also the intervention was demonstrated and role played to how to deliver the intervention activities with the home language script. The intervention itself was quite similar to the Lively RCT. The children received twice weekly language intervention for 8 weeks. For the bilingual project, the children, the intervention was delivered one-to-one in their home language by a speech language therapist with an interpreter within education settings, and homework was given to parents after every intervention session. So in terms of the results, there were definitely some positive results, but also there were some things that didn't go to plan. We were able to deliver 16 sessions of BEST in both Sylheti and Polish. And it wasn't possible to follow the single case study methodology that we planned because the children often didn't respond. But we did get some positive feedback from parents and education staff. So they reported that the Sylheti speaking child made progress in her use of Sylheti, and there was also now evidence of code switching, whereas there wasn't before. So code switching is very typical for bilingual speakers, and that's where they change languages within the same conversation or even in the same sentence. And for the Polish speaking child, it it was reported that he had made progress in his understanding of Polish. During the intervention sessions, both children rarely, if ever, spoke their home language. The Sileti-speaking child never spoke Sileti during the intervention, but she did speak English before and after the intervention sessions. The Polish child very occasionally spoke Polish during reward activities, but not during the intervention activities, and he didn't speak English at all. We tried to look at some of the reasons why this was happening and what we could do to change it. So cultural differences may be a reason the children didn't respond. In certain cultures, it might be more appropriate to have a more directive interaction style, so saying to the children, tell me, you say it. But as a speech and language therapist, this feels quite counterintuitive. As usual practice is to follow the child's lead and wait for them to respond. The language situation may have also been a factor. Both children were in English-speaking environments where their home language is not routinely spoken. They may have been aware that the speech and language therapist was an English speaker, even though the speech and language therapist tried not to speak English during the activities. Although the speech and language therapist learned to use some home language words and phrases during reward and warm-up activities to try and encourage home language use. The intervention was also delivered one-to-one, and the children may have felt more confident and comfortable to talk if it had been in a group situation. However, we did have issues trying to recruit children to the project. So in terms of working with interpreters, more time and more training was needed, even though the interpreters had received training before the assessment and intervention sessions. Regular practice and role-playing of activities was essential in virtually every intervention session. Even though the sessions were scripted, it was obvious that they added or changed words to the script, and both interpreters needed additional support in order to do this. And actually it was the penultimate session, session 15 out of 16, when the Sileti interpreter delivered the script 100% accurately. It was noted that the interpreters didn't naturally do incidental chat with the children in between activities, and this might be due to their job role, that they are trained to interpret languages but not necessarily work with children, or it might be to do with their background or cultural differences in interaction styles. So if we were to do a similar project again, we would definitely need to facilitate promotion of home language use more, and that might be through changing the session, so carrying out the intervention at home where there would be more home language speakers, so parents as well as the interpreters, in comparison to being in school. It'd be useful to use more home language activities with the child and interpreter before the intervention actually starts, again to promote home language use. We asked the interpreters towards the end of the project about typical adult-child interaction styles and cultural differences, but obviously in hindsight we should have asked them before the intervention started, but we didn't know the children would respond in the way that they did. And having the same interpreters for the duration of the project was a real advantage. We were able to build up a relationship with them and to train and coach them throughout the intervention sessions. So finally, in terms of working with bilingual children, extra time and preparation is key. Sessions are likely to take much longer than they would do if you were working with monolingual children. It's important to consider cultural differences throughout the assessment and intervention process in terms of adapting resources, but also thinking about differences in adult and child interaction styles. And working in home language for monolingual speech language therapists is difficult, but it is definitely possible. And we need to remember to meet the needs of bilingual children with speech and language and communication needs. Delivering intervention in their home language provides an equitable service. And thank you for listening.